Apes don't belong at events like this. The insult tore through the glittering ballroom, louder than the string quartet playing in the corner. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Champagne flutes halted halfway to lips. All eyes turned toward the source of the voice. A man in his late 30s, tall, broad-shouldered and dressed in a tailored crimson tuxedo, stood with a cruel smirk painted across his face. His hand was clenched tightly around the fabric of a midnight blue gown. The gown belonged to a poised black woman, also in her 30s, whose calm elegance contrasted sharply with his hostility. Gasps swept across the room. Guests in their late 30s and 40s, executives, philanthropists and socialites, all accustomed to polished manners, were stunned to hear such vulgarity erupt in what was supposed to be the most refined gala of the year. The woman stood still, her posture straight, her expression composed. She held a silver clutch in one hand, her other arm hanging at her side, refusing to flinch or give him the reaction he wanted. The insult, however, had landed like a slap across the entire hall. "Didn't you hear me?" The man sneered, tightening his grip and tugging at her gown again. His voice rose louder, as if to ensure every single person witnessed his humiliation. "You people don't belong here. This is not your world." Murmurs spread through the crowd. A woman in a red dress whispered to her companion, horrified. A man near the bar shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to intervene, but hesitant to cross the invisible line of confrontation. It was as though the entire room had been paralyzed, suspended between etiquette and outrage. The woman finally turned her head toward him, her gaze steady and sharp as glass. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Take your hand off me," she said, her tone low but commanding, every syllable crisp. The calmness unsettled him more than if she had screamed. His lips curled into a mocking laugh. "Or what? You'll cry? Run off and hope people forget you even showed up?" He yanked harder on the gown, as if determined to strip her of dignity in front of hundreds of witnesses. But she didn't move. She stood rooted, her chin slightly lifted, her silence echoing louder than his cruelty. Around them, the string quartet had stopped playing, the room holding its breath. Every guest knew this was no longer about a gown or a party. It was about respect, about belonging, about power. The woman's dark eyes burned with restrained fury, but her voice remained composed. "This is my world as much as yours, and tonight you'll regret forgetting that." A ripple of electricity shot through the air. Guests leaned closer, sensing the first sparks of a confrontation that was about to escalate beyond anything this ballroom had seen before. The tension in the ballroom thickened, pressing down on everyone like a storm cloud about to split open. The woman didn't move when the man's grip tightened on her gown again. Instead, she let her gaze travel slowly from his hand, up his arm, and finally to his face. Her stare was so cold it silenced the last nervous murmurs in the room. "Let go," she repeated, her voice low, calm, but edged with steel. The man laughed again, a brittle sound that echoed awkwardly. He wanted to appear in control, but beads of sweat had already begun to form along his temple. "You don't belong in this circle," he said louder, projecting his voice to the crowd as if performing for them. "Money, power, legacy, those are things earned by families like mine. Not." He stopped, the insult hanging unspoken but heavy in the air. Everyone knew what he meant. Gasps rippled again. The woman's expression didn't change, though her jaw set tighter. She lifted her free hand and, with a deliberate calmness, pried his fingers one by one from her gown. The silk slipped free, and she smoothed the fabric back over her hip with a grace that contrasted his crude aggression. "You confuse inheritance with merit," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "But merit stands on its own, even in the face of ignorance." Her words drew a sharp line in the air, slicing through the uneasy silence. Some guests looked away, ashamed. Others leaned forward, captivated. The man's face darkened, colour flooding his cheeks. He had not expected her to confront him so directly. "You dare lecture me?" His voice cracked with rage. He stepped closer, close enough that the space between them was charged with heat. His finger jabbed toward her chest, trembling not from fear but from fury. "You're nothing here. Do you understand? Nothing." She didn't flinch. Instead, she raised her chin higher. "Then why?" she asked, her words measured and piercing. "Is the entire room watching you unravel while I stand unshaken?" That landed. A ripple of approval hummed through the crowd. Small nods, a few murmured agreements, the beginnings of a shift. The man felt it too. He turned his head sharply toward the nearest table, as though daring anyone to speak up. No one did. But their silence wasn't consent this time. It was resistance. His fury boiled over. He reached for her arm, intending to drag her out, to reassert control by brute force. But before he could, another voice cut through the air like a blade. "That's enough." The words came from an older gentleman near the stage, a respected philanthropist in his late 50s whose presence carried weight. He rose slowly, his gaze fixed on the man in red. "You've embarrassed yourself enough tonight." The man froze, his hand still inches from her arm. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. The woman used the moment. She stepped forward, her shoulders squared, claiming the center of the ballroom as her own. The chandeliers above seemed to spotlight her, her confidence radiating. "This is not about me," she said clearly, scanning the room. "It's about every person who's ever been told they don't belong, by someone too small to see beyond themselves." Applause erupted, not thunderous yet, but steady, building. The crowd was beginning to shift, to choose sides. And it was clear who held the gravity in that room. The man's hand fell to his side, his jaw clenched. He wasn't done. Everyone could see it in the rigid set of his shoulders. But for the first time that night it was also clear, neither was she. The confrontation was only beginning. The air inside the ballroom had shifted. No longer was it filled with polite small talk and the clinking of crystal glasses. It now pulsed with unease, thick enough that even the chandeliers above seemed dimmer, as though the room itself was holding its breath. The man in the crimson tuxedo still stood rigid, his face flushed with anger, his fists opening and closing at his sides. The black woman in her 30s, graceful in her midnight blue gown, remained unmoved. Her calm presence had begun to fracture the illusion of his power. The crowd could feel it, and whispers darted like sparks between guests. "I can't believe he said that." She didn't even flinch. "She's stronger than he knows." Not everyone agreed. From a table near the center, a woman in her late 30s let out a sharp laugh, tilting her glass of champagne. "Oh, come on," she said loudly enough for the room to hear. "He's just saying what everyone's thinking. She doesn't belong here." The words sliced the room again. Several guests turned toward her with disapproval, while others averted their eyes, unwilling to take sides. The fracture in the room deepened. One side leaning toward the woman, drawn by her dignity, the other clinging to the man's arrogance as though his entitlement validated their own. The man seized on the support. "See?" he barked, pointing toward the woman in the red dress. "She gets it! This," he gestured toward the black woman, his voice dripping with disdain, "is a charade, and everyone here knows it." The black woman's eyes scanned the crowd, calm but piercing. She saw the hesitation in some, the quiet courage in others, and then, with measured grace, she stepped forward, closing the space between herself and her accuser. "Look around you," she said, her voice carrying across the marble floor. "Who's disrupting this evening? Who turned this celebration into a circus? It isn't me. It's the man who cannot stand to see someone he doesn't understand take up space he believes is only his." A murmur of agreement spread louder this time. A man in his 40s near the bar nodded firmly. "She's right," he said, his voice audible. "We all came here for a gala, not a tantrum." The crimson-suited man's head snapped toward him, eyes blazing. "Shut your mouth!" he shouted. His composure was slipping further with every second, his control unraveling under the weight of his own rage. The black woman remained steady. She didn't need to raise her voice. The contrast between his fury and her poise was speaking louder than anything else. "Every insult you've thrown tonight," she said, her tone sharp but calm, "says more about you than it ever could about me." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of phones clicking. A few guests had begun recording discreetly, their cameras capturing the clash, sensing history in the making. The man's jaw clenched. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with the realization that he was losing the crowd. He glanced toward his companions, men in matching tuxedos who shifted uneasily, clearly uncertain whether to step in or step back. The ballroom was no longer his stage. It was hers, and the audience knew it. The tension snapped tighter, like a violin string pulled to the edge of breaking. The crimson-suited man, his face blotched with fury, flicked his hand toward the far side of the room. 2 more men rose from their seats, both in their early 40s, also dressed in sharp tuxedos that mirrored his. They moved with deliberate arrogance, weaving through the crowd until they stood at his shoulders, forming a wall of hostility around the woman in blue. The crowd shifted uneasily. A few guests took small steps back, retreating toward the edges of the ballroom. Others leaned forward, their curiosity stronger than their fear. Phones discreetly lifted higher, the glow of cameras catching the new arrivals. The crimson-suited man grinned, regaining a shred of confidence with reinforcements at his side. "Now do you see?" he boomed, sweeping his hand theatrically toward her. "This is not your space. You are nothing but a guest in someone else's world." The black woman did not move. Her shoulders stayed square, her posture regal. Her gaze swept across the 3 men now circling her, then back to the crowd. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost quiet, yet every corner of the ballroom seemed to hear it. "It always takes more than one of you to face one of me," she said. A ripple went through the audience. Some gasped, others chuckled softly. A man in his late 30s at the bar shook his head and murmured, "She's fearless." The crimson-suited man sneered. "Fearless? She's outnumbered." He snapped his fingers sharply, and one of his companions stepped closer, invading her space, his shadow falling over her gown. Still, she did not retreat. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, eyes locked on the man blocking her path. "Step aside," she said evenly. The man smirked, but his smirk faltered under her steady gaze. For a moment it looked as if he might obey. Instead, he muttered under his breath, "You should be grateful we even let you in here." That line landed hard. Several guests recoiled, their discomfort turning to visible anger. A woman in a green silk dress, late 30s, stood abruptly and snapped, "Enough! This is shameful!" Her voice cracked through the air like a whip, drawing scattered applause. The crimson-suited man ignored her, though the applause rattled him. He leaned closer to the black woman, his voice dropping to a growl. "One last chance. Walk out now, before I make sure you're dragged out." The woman's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, not amusement but certainty. She took a single step forward, closing the space between them, so close that he had to lean back slightly. Her voice, barely above a whisper, carried farther than his threats. "I don't walk away from places I own," she said. The ballroom erupted. Some gasped, others cheered outright, and more phones tilted upward, not capturing the spark that had just shifted the entire atmosphere. The 3 men faltered, their wall of arrogance beginning to crumble. The crimson-suited man clenched his jaw, realizing too late that this was no longer his performance. The stage was hers, and the crowd was already choosing who to follow. The crimson-suited man's grin collapsed into a snarl. The murmurs of the crowd, the applause that had dared to rise against him, every sound stoked his rage until it boiled over. His companions stiffened at his side, but none of them seemed eager to act first. It was clear even they sensed the tide of the room shifting. Then, with a sudden lunge, he grabbed for her wrist. The move was sharp, desperate, and utterly unrefined. Gasps tore through the ballroom as crystal glasses rattled on tables from the shock of bodies jerking back. But the woman did not stumble. Instead, she froze in place, her midnight blue gown swaying only slightly from the force. Her wrist was trapped in his grip, but her eyes never wavered. Calm, cold, calculating. "You don't get to touch me," she said, her voice still steady, a razor blade wrapped in silk. He yanked harder, his jaw clenching, veins straining in his neck. "You don't get to tell me what I can or can't do," he bellowed, his voice cracking under the weight of fury. The crowd erupted in outrage. A man in his 40s shouted, "Let her go." A woman near the stage cried out, covering her mouth. Several guests began moving forward, but hesitation kept them at the edges, unwilling to be the first to intervene. The woman lifted her free hand slowly and, with a single motion, placed it firmly against his chest. The gesture was not violent, not frantic, just deliberate. "Release me," she commanded. For the first time, his confidence wavered. There was something about her tone, something unyielding, that cut through his bravado. But his pride, swollen and fragile, refused to let go. He pulled again, harder this time, as if brute strength alone could reclaim the authority he felt slipping away. Her eyes narrowed. Then, with a swift twist of her wrist, she broke free from his grip. The movement was precise, controlled, and it left him stumbling half a step forward, caught off balance before the entire room. The ballroom gasped again, but this time it wasn't out of shock. It was admiration. Several clapped, some even cheered. The crimson-suited man turned in fury toward the sound, his eyes scanning for dissenters, but there were too many. The approval was spreading. "You dare embarrass me?" he roared, his voice hoarse. He turned back to her, raising his hand as though he might strike. But before he could follow through, her voice cut him down. Low, sharp, and deadly calm. "Think very carefully about your next move. This room is watching, and so is the world." Every phone lifted higher, their cameras glowing like stars in the dim ballroom. The man froze, his raised hand trembling in the air. He hadn't realized how many eyes and lenses were locked on him, the weight of being witnessed pressed down like iron. She stepped forward, closing the space between them once more. "You think this is about me," she said, her voice carrying across the marble. "But tonight, everyone will remember it's about you, and the choice you make right now will define you." The silence was deafening. The man's hand hovered, his chest heaving, sweat glistening at his temple. For the first time, he looked less like a master of the room and more like a man cornered by his own arrogance. And the woman? She hadn't raised her voice once. Yet somehow she stood taller, brighter, and infinitely more powerful than the three men arrayed against her. The silence fractured at last. From the back of the dining room, a man in his late 30s pushed back his chair. The scrape of wood against polished floor cut through the stillness like a warning bell. He rose, phone in hand, and announced flatly, "I've been recording," since he grabbed her arm. "You'll want to think twice before this goes further." Eyes turned to Harold, the manager, whose jaw tightened as the red glow of phone cameras multiplied around the room. For every guest still hiding behind their wine glasses, 2 more now raised devices, their screens glowing like fireflies. Vanessa Carter stood in the center, unshaken. The midnight blue silk of her gown shimmered under the chandeliers, her composure drawing strength from the very chaos that had been meant to unravel her. She didn't have to lift a finger. The room was beginning to fight for her. "Don't you see what's happening?" Harold barked, his voice cracking with fury. He pointed at Vanessa again, his finger trembling with rage. "She's manipulating you. She doesn't belong here, and you're letting her play you like fools." The words landed poorly. A woman in her 40s, pearls draped elegantly at her neck, rose from her table near the stage. "Enough," she said, her voice ringing clear. "I came here to enjoy dinner, not watch you humiliate a paying guest who's shown nothing but grace." Scattered applause broke out, hesitant but real. The momentum shifted like a tide pulling out to sea, leaving Harold stranded on shrinking ground. His 2 companions, men in their 40s dressed to impress, exchanged uneasy glances. The certainty in their smirks had dissolved into sweat. Vanessa finally spoke, her tone calm but laced with undeniable authority. "You're proving my point with every word. You think raising your voice makes you right, but everyone in this room knows better." The murmurs grew louder. Someone near the bar clapped once, deliberately, and another followed. Within seconds the sound grew, applause spreading in waves. Not everyone joined. Some still clung to silence, but the balance had tipped. Harold slammed his fist against the counter, the crash jolting the nearest glasses. "You're all being deceived," he shouted, though his voice now sounded more desperate than dominant. A man in his 50s, seated alone with a half-empty bottle of wine, shook his head. "No," he said loudly, his words slow and certain. "We're finally seeing the truth." The weight of those words hung in the air. Guests turned their focus back to Vanessa, not Harold. She stood poised, chin lifted, radiating the kind of quiet power no outburst could ever drown. "Justice doesn't always scream," she said softly, but the room carried her words for her. "Sometimes it waits, and sometimes it only takes one person brave enough to stand up to remind everyone else where they stand." The applause swelled again, bolder this time. The waitress Elena, trembling but resolute, stepped closer to Vanessa's side. "She's right," she said. Her voice cracked, but she didn't waver. "I checked her name. She belongs here." And in that moment, it was clear. The restaurant had split, but the larger half now stood with Vanessa. Harold's authority was crumbling, slipping like sand through clenched fists. The battle was far from finished. But the crowd had chosen its side, and the weight of public judgment was shifting fast. The applause didn't fade right away. It lingered, clapping hands echoing against polished glass and marble walls, refusing to be swallowed. Harold stood stiff at the counter, fists curling so tight his knuckles whitened. He could feel the tide slipping away, but his pride, sharpened by years of unchecked authority, wouldn't let him step back. "Enough of this circus," he barked, his voice raw with desperation. "If she doesn't leave now, I'll make sure she never sets foot in another restaurant in this city again." The room froze. The arrogance in his words was staggering, but it was the certainty with which he spoke that sent a chill through the audience. It was more than a threat. It was the confidence of a man used to wielding connections like weapons. Vanessa Carter remained still. Her dark eyes held his, unflinching. "So now it's blackmail?" she asked softly, but the way her voice carried made it sound like a verdict. Harold leaned forward, lowering his tone to a growl, though half the room still heard him. "You think tonight embarrasses me? I have friends in higher places than you could imagine. With one call I can ruin your name, your career, your life. Walk away while you still have the chance." Gasps scattered through the crowd. The pearl-draped woman muttered, "He's lost it." Phones tilted higher, recording every word. A man in his 40s near the bar whispered to his companion, "Does he even realize he's admitting this on camera?" Vanessa lifted her glass and set it gently back down, the stem clicking against the counter like punctuation. "You believe threats are power," she said, her tone calm, deliberate. "But power built on fear is fragile. One moment like this," she gestured subtly to the watching crowd, "and it collapses." Harold's face flushed crimson to match his suit. He slammed the counter again, rattling silverware and sending a knife clattering to the floor. "You arrogant woman," he spat. "You'll regret crossing me. Everyone here will forget you tomorrow, but they'll still come to me for a table, for a favor, for a future. I decide who belongs and who doesn't, not you." The crowd shifted again, unease rippling like wind through tall grass. But this time, the fear wasn't aimed at Vanessa. It was aimed at Harold. His words had grown darker, more reckless, less defensible with each breath. Elena, the hostess, stepped closer, her voice trembling but firm. "You don't decide who belongs. Not tonight. Not ever." A small cheer broke from the back of the room, followed by another clap and then another. The tension was breaking, cracking under the weight of collective courage. Vanessa remained the calmest of them all. She didn't shout. She didn't flinch. She simply adjusted the sleeve of her gown and looked Harold dead in the eye. "Threats only work on the fearful," she said, "and I am not afraid of you." The words landed like a gavel. The crowd stirred, emboldened. Harold, for all his fury, looked smaller now, less a gatekeeper, more a desperate man clawing to hold a crumbling throne. And still the night was far from finished. For a long second, Harold's words echoed in the silence. "I decide who belongs and who doesn't." They hung in the air like a noose, heavy and undeniable. But instead of tightening around Vanessa, they coiled around him. The first voice to cut through came from the back, measured, calm, and full of disdain. "You've just decided your own fate." A man in his late 40s, seated with colleagues, stood with his phone still raised. His voice carried authority, the kind that came from years of leadership. "This entire room heard you, and so will the world." Applause burst sharper than before, fueled by outrage rather than politeness. Several guests rose from their chairs now, no longer hiding behind glassware or whispers, phones tilted higher, red lights blinking like dozens of watchful eyes. Harold's face drained of colour. He opened his mouth to retort, but a woman in emerald green cut him off. She stepped into the open aisle, her heels clicking like a drumbeat. "You don't own this place, Harold. Not the tables, not the people, and certainly not her." She gestured to Vanessa. "The more you talk, the more you prove she's the only one with dignity here." Cheers followed, not just claps, but voices raised. "That's right! We stand with her!" The sound swelled, filling the restaurant like a tide washing away the last remnants of Harold's control. Vanessa hadn't moved. Her stillness was power itself, commanding without demanding. She turned her head slightly, acknowledging the growing wall of support around her. Her lips parted, her voice calm but resonant. "I don't need to silence you, Harold. You're doing that yourself." The line hit like a spark in dry grass. The crowd erupted again, laughter and applause rolling through the space. Harold, once the loudest presence in the room, now looked small against the roar of collective judgment. Desperate, he turned to his two companions, gesturing sharply. "Do something!" But neither moved. Their earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by nervous glances and stiff silence. The power dynamic had shifted beyond repair, and they knew better than to follow a sinking ship. Cowards! Harold spat at them, but his insult rang hollow. At that moment, Elena, the young hostess, stepped forward with newfound courage. Her voice trembled, but she spoke clearly enough for every phone to catch. "She's not trespassing. She's on the reservation list. She belongs here. You've lied, Harold, and everyone knows it." The crowd cheered louder this time, with whistles and shouts. Some diners pounded their tables like a drumbeat of defiance. What had begun as unease was now open rebellion. Harold's lips curled, but his words faltered. The air no longer bent to his will. Every phrase he tried to form dissolved under the weight of cameras and the judgmental stares of people who had finally chosen a side. Vanessa stepped forward, closing the space between them. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was a verdict. "You built your authority on fear," she said. "But tonight they've seen through you, and fear doesn't survive in the light." The room roared its approval, the sound swelling like thunder. Harold stood cornered, isolated, a man undone not by her shouts but by her silence, her patience, and now the unified voice of the crowd. For the first time all evening, he looked unsure where to put his hands, his eyes darting not in dominance but in search of escape. And Vanessa? She simply stood taller, brighter, as if the chandelier light itself had chosen her. The roar of the crowd settled into a steady hum of tension. People leaned forward in their chairs, phones raised, eyes fixed on Harold like spectators waiting for the final act of a tragedy. He stood behind the counter, his crimson suit clashing with the pallor creeping into his face. "I don't care what you record," he barked, his voice raw, cracking under strain. "This footage will mean nothing. You think the internet will save you? I've outlasted worse storms than this." But no one seemed convinced. A man near the bar laughed openly, shaking his head. "The internet doesn't forget," he muttered, loud enough for his phone to catch. Harold's eyes darted to Vanessa. For a flicker of a second, his expression wavered, uncertainty bleeding through his anger. But his pride shoved it back down, and he leaned across the counter with venom. "You're not a guest," he hissed. "You're a fraud. Probably stole that reservation. People like you always find ways to cheat." Gasps rippled again, but this time, instead of silence, voices pushed back. "That's a lie. She showed her card. We all saw it." The momentum of the room had turned into a wave, and Harold's words were swallowed by it. Vanessa didn't flinch. She took a slow step closer, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a metronome marking his unraveling. "You keep repeating yourself," she said calmly, "as if louder lies will cover the truth. But lies don't grow stronger in the light. They wither." The applause that followed was sharp, deliberate. Guests clapped not out of politeness but conviction. The sound wrapped around Harold like chains. Still, he lashed out again. "This establishment is mine to control," he shouted, voice cracking. "I decide who stays and who goes." His fist slammed the counter, rattling glasses until one toppled and shattered on the floor. The sound jolted the crowd, but it only deepened their resolve. "No," said a steady voice. It came from the man seated by the window, the business traveller who had spoken earlier. He stood now, tall and certain, his phone raised. "Control isn't yours anymore. We've all seen too much." The room murmured agreement, nods and affirmations rippling outward. Harold looked around, eyes wide, but found no support. Even his companions stood stiff and silent, unwilling to shoulder the weight of his downfall. Vanessa's eyes never left his. Her tone was firm, almost gentle, but undeniable. The more you fight, the more you reveal yourself. Every word, every outburst, it's not about me. It's about the fear you carry, fear of being seen as small. The silence after her words was profound. No one clapped this time. No one spoke. The truth had landed too heavy, too precise. Even Harold felt it, his breath hitching, his chest rising and falling like a man drowning in shallow water. For the first time all evening, his mouth opened without words. His eyes flicked around the room, searching for escape routes that no longer existed. Vanessa took another step forward, her presence filling the space between them. "The truth is already here," she said quietly, but every phone captured it. "And tonight it won't be hidden." The crowd leaned in, sensing it. The moment the mask finally cracked. The room had grown still, the kind of stillness that comes not from peace but from anticipation. Dozens of phones hovered in the air, their red dots recording every twitch of Harold's face, every tremor in his voice. He was cornered. But pride doesn't die quietly. "You think you've won?" Harold barked, though his voice cracked like glass. His eyes were wide, pupils darting between Vanessa and the crowd. Sweat streaked down his temples, shining under the chandelier light. "You think this little stunt changes anything? I've built this place. I've built connections that will bury you." He snatched up a glass from the counter and hurled it to the floor. The crash sent shards scattering across the marble, sharp edges catching the light. Several guests gasped and stepped back, but none left. Their phones stayed trained on him. "Get out of my restaurant!" he roared, pointing at Vanessa with a trembling finger. His voice was louder than before, but the desperation behind it made the command sound less like authority and more like pleading. Vanessa didn't move. Her posture was steady, chin lifted, eyes locked on him like a lighthouse fixed against a storm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "If you had any control left," she said evenly, "you wouldn't have to scream for it." The words pierced through the chaos, silencing the room again. The audience felt it, the balance shifting like a tide. Harold's shouts weren't proof of power. They were proof of collapse. His two companions finally stirred, exchanging panicked glances. One reached for Harold's arm, muttering, "That's enough, you're making it worse." But Harold yanked free, shoving him back with a force that nearly toppled the man into a chair. The crowd gasped again, shock mounting. "You're all blind," Harold shouted, voice ragged. "She doesn't belong here. None of you belong here without me. I made this city's dining scene. I decide who rises and who falls." The arrogance in his words, paired with the glass shards glittering on the floor, painted him as unhinged rather than powerful. Then Vanessa stepped forward. Just one step. It wasn't dramatic, but the silence it commanded was absolute. Her heels clicked against the marble like a gavel striking wood. "You don't decide anything tonight," she said, her voice calm but carrying to every corner. "The people here do, and they've already spoken." A swell of applause erupted, louder than any before. Not scattered, not hesitant. This was unified, thunderous. Diners stood, clapping, cheering, their voices rising in a wave that swallowed Harold's final screams. He tried to shout over them, his arms flailing, but his words were lost in the roar. His face twisted with rage, but his power was gone, drained into the hands of the crowd, into the silence of the woman he had tried to humiliate. And in that moment, even before the final reveal, everyone could feel it. Harold was finished. The thunder of applause ebbed slowly, like waves retreating after a storm, but the energy in the room remained charged. Harold stood panting behind the counter, chest heaving, eyes wild. His crimson suit clung damp to his back. He looked less like a manager and more like a man unraveling before a jury that had already reached its verdict. Vanessa Carter hadn't moved. She stood tall in her midnight blue gown, the spotlight of the chandeliers catching in her eyes. Every camera in the room was locked on her, waiting, not for Harold, not for his excuses, but for her next word. She let the silence stretch. Every second was deliberate, every heartbeat amplifying the inevitability of what was about to come. Then she spoke, calm, controlled, unflinching. "You've spent this entire evening telling me I don't belong, that I'm an intruder, that I should leave quietly before you ruin me." Her words rang across the marble floor, each syllable sharp as steel. She paused, scanning the room, letting the crowd lean into her cadence. "But you never once asked yourself the simplest question." Harold blinked, sweat dripping into his eyes. His lips parted, but no sound came. Vanessa's voice deepened, steady as a drumbeat. "Who do you think paid for this event? Who signed the checks that built the partnerships you brag about? Who actually owns the space you stand in tonight?" The room froze. Forks hovered mid-air. Glasses remained suspended in nervous hands. A ripple of realization spread before anyone spoke. Harold stammered, You can't." Vanessa cut through him like a blade. "I'm not a guest here, Harold. I am the primary investor in this restaurant group. The name on the deed isn't yours, it's mine." Gasps exploded through the room. Someone near the back shouted, "No way!" Another voice cried, "Check the filings! She's telling the truth!" Phones whirred as people scrambled to capture every word, some even searching documents in real time. Harold's face went ashen. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. The arrogance that had fueled him all night drained into silence. Vanessa stepped closer, her heels steady, her voice unwavering. "You tried to strip me of dignity in front of strangers, but tonight you stripped only yourself of credibility, of respect, of power." The applause that followed was deafening. Not hesitant claps this time, but a full eruption. Cheers, whistles, people rising to their feet. The sound filled every corner of the restaurant, drowning out the broken man behind the counter. Harold staggered back, his hands trembling as though the ground itself had shifted beneath him. His two companions took subtle steps away, unwilling to share in his collapse. The red suit that had once made him imposing now looked like a costume, gaudy and hollow. Vanessa turned slightly, her gaze sweeping the crowd. This space was never his to grant or deny. It belongs to everyone who walks through its doors with respect, and as of tonight, it belongs to truth. The room erupted again, louder than before. Some guests stood on chairs, others pounded their tables, all while phones captured every frame of Harold's humiliation and Vanessa's rise. For the first time that evening, Harold lowered his eyes. He looked broken, small, finished. And Vanessa Carter, no longer simply a guest, but revealed as the black CEO who held the deed in her hand, stood at the center of it all, unshaken, untouchable. The cheers did not fade this time. They grew, rolling through the restaurant in waves so powerful the walls seemed to vibrate. Dozens of phones recorded, lights blinking like stars above an ocean of witnesses. What began as dinner service had transformed into a reckoning. Harold stood at the counter, trembling. His crimson suit, once meant to impress, clung like a parody of power. Sweat darkened his collar, his chest heaved, and his eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape that no longer existed. The crowd had turned. There was no path back. Vanessa Carter stood just a few feet away, her midnight blue gown glowing under the chandelier's golden light. She hadn't raised her voice once, yet the room was hers entirely. Authority radiated from her, not through threats or theatrics, but through unshakable composure. "Tonight," she said, her voice carrying with precision, "you showed everyone here who you really are. Entitled, small, afraid. You tried to take from me what was never yours to control." Harold staggered forward, his lips moving but no words emerging. The crowd's cheers drowned him, and the futility in his gestures made him look more like a desperate child than a man of influence. His companions had already backed into the shadows, unwilling to share in his collapse. Vanessa turned to the guests, her gaze sweeping across every table, every camera. "But what he failed to see," she continued, "is that dignity isn't granted by gatekeepers. It lives in each of us, and tonight you all stood against his arrogance. You chose truth." The room erupted again, not just in applause but in chants, voices calling her name, voices demanding justice. It was no longer just about Vanessa. It was about every person in the room who had seen injustice and refused to stay silent. She let them chant for a moment before lifting her hand gently. The room quieted on instinct, as though she were a conductor guiding an orchestra. "This place will change," she said firmly. "From this night forward, it will stand as a space where no one is diminished for who they are, where no one is told they don't belong. That era ended tonight." Phones caught every word, streaming live across platforms, ensuring the story would not remain within these walls. The weight of her declaration was already stretching beyond the restaurant, into the city, into the world. Harold sank into a chair, his head in his hands. He had no defense left, no audience left, no power left. His reign ended not with a dramatic collapse, but with silence, broken only by the roar of the crowd around him. Vanessa stepped onto the small stage at the end of the dining room, the very place where Harold had tried to humiliate her. Under the chandelier, she stood tall, shoulders back, her presence commanding. She was no longer the woman accused of trespassing. She was the black CEO, owner, and undeniable leader. And as the applause thundered one final time, Vanessa Carter smiled, not in triumph over Harold, but in affirmation of something greater. Justice had been served, not with shouting, not with violence, but with the quiet, unshakable power of truth. The night that began with an insult ended with revelation, and no one in that room would ever forget it.